welcome to today's FCICA product promotional webinar series. We are pleased to have Arthur Minty with us today to talk about Laticrete International. And Arthur, I'll turn the session right over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's session. We know you're all busy, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend this informational session here. And we're going to talk about a topic that is really growing in popularity. And we're actually going to talk about two distinct types of finishes, and then which Laticrete products can be used to install those materials. So we're going to talk about the large, thin porcelain tiles, which are now called gauged tiles and slabs. And then we're also going to talk about standard large format porcelain tile as well. So there's two distinct types of finishes that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to get into some of the nuances of each type and what are some of the intricacies of both, the differences, similarities, and then how we can successfully install both of them. So we have four learning objectives today. The first one is to define the types of tiles that we just talked about. What are they? And where would they be used? We're also going to talk about which Laticrete specific installation materials can be used. We're going to talk about tools, especially when it comes to the thin gauged large format materials. There's different tools that are needed and what those are, how to handle those materials. And then the last one is special design considerations and what we can do to all ensure that we can get a successful installation. So just some general trends within the ceramic tile and porcelain tile industry. We're seeing larger and larger sizes hitting the market. This is a trend that we're even seeing in Europe, and it's making its way over here into the States. Fewer grout lines, that's always been a trouble spot for tile installation, so people don't want to see grout lines because they're a maintenance issue. And these panels really are addressing the growing green and sustainable trend in the construction industry in general. And if you really think about these large, thin materials, they're really half the thickness and half the weight of conventional tiles. So this less weight reduces stress on buildings and engineering on buildings. It also reduces raw material content by even up to 70%. It can reduce energy consumption by 45%. CO2 emissions, it can reduce that as well. And these lighter weight materials also mean a lighter footprint per square foot. So we really see that these trends in going to these larger thin materials really fits in with the entire construction trend of going lightweight and having more sustainable building designs. So let's talk about these thin or gauged porcelain tile and panels. So just the name of this material has evolved over the years. They started out being thin porcelain tile panels, reduced thickness tiles. We've heard all kinds of different phrases. We finally created a couple of standards. ANSI A108.19 is the installation standard for these materials, and they settled on the title gauged porcelain tiles and panels. And then A137.3 is the standard that defines the product itself, how it's manufactured, and what criteria is required for that panel to meet in order to meet that standard. So these are the materials that range in thickness, typically from 3 millimeter all the way up to maybe 5.5 or 6 millimeter in thickness. On the other hand, so that's the type of tile that you see on the left-hand side here. That's that gauged porcelain panel. That's that thin material, and it's really large in size. The other type of tile that we're going to talk about today is just large format tiles in general. And in either case, per our industry, for the Tile Council of North America and ANSI, any large format material is any tile that has an edge that's greater than 15 inches. So you see that encompasses both sides here, both types, the gauged thin tiles that we see on the left, and also our standard thickness porcelain materials. And those standard thickness ones, or the regular thickness, they're usually 5/16 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. Some are even thicker. We've seen them up to even 5/8 of an inch. So this is kind of a contrast between your regular tile in a 9mm thickness, right, or your typical 3/8 of an inch thickness, and then your thin gauged panels, which are 3mm, or even just 1/8 of an inch. Some of those gauged tiles even have a reinforcing scrim that's attached to the back of them. That gives it a little bit more reinforcement in some demanding applications. And some manufacturers may recommend the mesh back material in some applications as opposed to the ones without the mesh. And those panels can be as large as 5 foot by 10 foot in size. So they're pretty big panels, and they do require some special handling. So these thin tiles, they have a lot of uses. They can be used both interior and exterior. They can be used on walls and floors. And one of the best options for these materials is in remodeling, in tile over tile applications. Because these materials are so thin and so light in weight, they don't really add an appreciable thickness to an existing floor or wall for that matter, and they're lightweight, so they're not adding really a lot of extra load to an installation. So we're seeing that trend as well with these materials in the tile over tile application. So it's great for remodeling. It minimizes that thicker additional build out, and they're perfect because it keeps the height down and the weight down as well. So the installation systems and products that are used for these materials is a little bit different. So just in taking a look at this photo right here, you can start to see that there's something different about the way these materials are put into place. So what we're seeing there, that's like an edge leveling system, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. But it just to set the tone for these thin gauge tiles, it is a much different application than using a standard thickness tile. And since that is the case, then you want to make sure also that the labor that we're using is also something that lends itself to a successful installation. So our entire industry has created what we call an ACT program, or an advanced certification program. And we have several modules that are here. It's a joint effort by all our industry partners. And we actually can have modules that train on these types of tiles and panels to make sure that we have a successful installation. So qualified labor and experienced labor on installing these materials is very, very important. There's also industry help available from the Tile Council of North America and also from ANSI. As we mentioned before, there were several new standards that were created for these products, and following those standards can make sure that we have a successful installation and one that's trouble-free. And also, when we have these successful installations, that also promotes more tile consumption, and that's good for our entire industry. That's what we want to see. We want to see more tile finishes being specified and used in any application. So let's get into the installation sequence, and we're now going to talk a little bit about some of the Laticrete products that can also be used with these installations. So the first thing is we want to make sure that we have a good substrate, right? We're going to talk about the differences between concrete and framed substrates. We're going to go through surface preparation and leveling. We're going to talk about certain accessories, maybe waterproofing, crack isolation, sound control, something else that might have to go in there, maybe even floor warming. And then what are the adhesive mortars that can be used? And then we're also going to talk a little bit about grout and movement joints as well. So that's pretty much the sequence. We obviously start with a good substrate. We want to make sure that it's solid. We're going to talk about concrete first. And we really want to make sure that we have a nice, smooth, flat surface, because as you saw, those panels are larger and larger. And as they continue to get larger, your concrete has to be even more flatter and even more in tolerance in order to accept these types of finishes. Smaller tiles, you could probably hide some imperfections and irregularities in a substrate, but these large format materials, you really cannot hide them. So we want to talk about floor flatness a little bit, and we want to see how that kind of correlates to the tile industry, and it helps us get the installation on the right foot. So here's a chart that basically talks about floor flatness. So that's that FF number. And you'll see, different columns here. And as the tile size gets larger, the column on the left-hand side, as the tile size gets larger, you'll see that a higher FF number or floor flatness number is required in order to make sure that that floor can receive these types of finishes. Now, the challenge always is how the concrete industry and the tile industry, how they can get together to make sure that we're providing smooth substrates for these finishes. So just an example, a concrete contractor will have in his contract an FF number that he has to hit. So say his FF number is 25. And if you look at that chart, that FF number of 25 is typically a 1/4 inch and 10 foot if you're using the straight edge method, which is typically what a tile setter will use to measure and to make sure that his floor is flat enough. So that might be okay if it's a 12 by 12 tile or a smaller module. But as you see, if you get larger, you're going to even need a tighter tolerance. So the challenge here is to have specifiers understand the difference between what a concrete contractor is obligated and required to do per his specification, and then what the tile contractor is required to do per his specification. And there's a gap sometimes. So what we do is we try to encourage specifiers to carry a little extra in their budgets for additional surface preparation, especially when using these larger module tiles. That's really the only way that you're going to be able to get a floor that's flat enough to be able to receive these types of finishes. So we know that that's not always something that specifiers want to hear, but unfortunately it is a reality. So these floors do have to be flat enough in order to receive these materials. If you also see the chart going across the top to the right, as the joint size gets smaller, so starting at a 1/4 inch to 3/16 to 1/8, you also see that the tolerance of floor flatness also has to increase, because the tighter the joint is, the flatter the floor has to be as well. This kind of illustrates to you what that 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet might be, and no greater than a 1/16 of an inch in any given foot. Obviously, these are exaggerated to show you the difference, but if you can see these peaks and valleys, this floor can still be in tolerance in an 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet, but you see the deviations there. Those deviations really can create some problems for these types of large format tiles and panels. So we want to make sure that we bring them into conformance and use a suitable leveling material to make sure that we can bring them into tolerance. And again, for these large materials, the Tile Council and ANSI recommends that the substrate variation not exceed an 1/8 of an inch in 10 feet. So that's a floor flatness of 50. You really will have to find, it'll be really challenging for a concrete contractor to hit that. So there will be some sort of surface preparation involved. So if you're specifying or you're bidding on projects that have these large materials, just make sure that that floor surface preparation is something that's being considered. Also, lippage, or the difference between the height of one tile to the next tile, can also create some challenges. So the floor flatness really plays into this as well. There's also warpage tolerances, and using patterns can also exaggerate or exacerbate a lippage and can create that look in that photo on the lower left-hand side there. Obviously, that's unsightly. It can also be a safety hazard as well, so we want to make sure that we have a nice, smooth, flat surface. and also that we use patterns that are also acceptable. And I'm going to show you a photo in a second that talks about offset or running bond patterns. If you notice that we've illustrated on the left, on the top left there, a 50% offset bond and a 30% offset for running bond patterns. And really the industry in ANSI has taken a position that the maximum offset should be about 30 to 33% to minimize the lippage that could be experienced on the floor. The longer these tiles are becoming, so the plank type pattern is really gaining in popularity. And that plank has an inherent warpage factor built into it. And when that occurs, if you place it at a 50% running bond, it'll be very challenging for the installer to make sure that that floor is flat enough. So per ANSI, in ANSI A108, it's recommended that the running bond not exceed 33%. And this is one of the reasons why. If you take a look at this photo here, you'll see a 50% offset. And you can see the way these long plank-style tiles kind of cup. See, there's that inherent warpage that's built into it. Now, those tiles may be in tolerance per the way they're manufactured because there is a built-in warpage factor, but putting it at a 50% offset can create this unsightly lippage. If the tiles were put at a 33% offset, you would not see this type of shadowing and this type of lippage. So just something to keep in mind too when laying out and installing these types of floors. All right, so we're ready to prepare the concrete and the surfaces to receive the finishes. So Laticrete produces a whole host of materials that can be used to prepare concrete floors. So we have our traditional thick bed mortars, which is a 3701 fortified mortar bed. That's basically a sand cement mix with polymer additives that can be used for bonded and unbonded mortar beds. Ideal for very demanding applications. It's used extensively in showers, swimming pools, and decks, and everything else that you can possibly imagine, both vertically and also horizontally. We also have a whole host of self-leveling products that is our NXT line. So we have moisture mitigation products, we have patches, skim coats, various types of self-levelers that can go up to different thicknesses. So you can prepare a floor in any regard that you might need. So speed, if speed is a factor, usually the self-levelers are the better way to go. If there's pitching and shaping required, maybe the mortar bed is the better way to go there because you can actually screed it by hand, you can level it and pitch it as necessary. So use the right type of product to prepare the substrate, again, to get it nice and smooth, to get it within tolerance in order to be able to receive these finishes. There's also other products as far as adhesive mortars that can come into play. Products that used to be called medium bed mortars are now called large and heavy tile mortars. And in some cases, they were inappropriately used. Is probably the best way to say it. Some of those mortars could be built up to a 1/2 inch thickness, some even up to 3/4 of an inch thickness. But they were used to true up and prepare surfaces that were really out of tolerance, and they really shouldn't have been used that way. These mortars are really designed to just install these types of finishes and not to prepare a slab or a surface that's out of tolerance. So again, go back to those materials that we talked about a little bit before, thick bed mortars, self-levelers or patching mortars. That's what you want to use first in order to minimize this type of lippage. Then you can use a large and heavy tile mortar, which we'll talk about in a second, to install the finishes. The goal though is to minimize that lippage and to create a nice smooth substrate. So now we got our surface preparation all in order. We're nice and level, we're flat, and we're smooth. And now you might want to start thinking about what other types of materials may be used in an application. Is it a wet area? Does that require waterproofing? Is the finish potentially prone to cracking, or might be some cracks in the substrate as well? Does a crack isolation membrane make sense for the application? Is sound control needed, whether it's regulated by code or by city ordinance? And even floor warming can also be considered. So Laticrete has a product for every one of these special considerations. And in some cases, you even have combination membranes, like our Hydraband that we see depicted there is both waterproof and also acts as a crack isolation membrane. So you get a multifunctional membrane to be used in some of these applications. So again, the sequence is always prepare your floors first, or prepare your walls first, get them nice and level and smooth, and then you follow that with the required accessory, a membrane, sound control, or floor warming. So here's some other products that Laticrete also makes. You'll see our floor warming on our left there. We have several types of floor warming systems. We have the mesh system you see depicted there. We also have a loose wire system, and we're going to be coming out with a system very soon that can be installed in one of our uncoupling membranes. So floor heat in conjunction with uncoupling. So a really, really cool and unique system for floor warming. On the right, you see our 170 sound and crack isolation mat. Again, that can be placed over any surface preparation, whether it's self-leveling or a thick bed mortar. And then you can install that and then place your finishes over the top. Okay, so let's now get into installing the material. So we've prepared the floors, we've used our accessories, we're ready to go now in order to set these types of materials. So again, if you take a look at some of the tools that are here, very different than your typical traditional ceramic or porcelain tile. What you're seeing there is a frame that is tipped over. It can ride, or these panels can ride on them, and then they can be flipped over to install them. So these are called installation frames. And as you pick them up, it keeps the tile or the panel from warping and twisting and cracking. So the tools are very important in order to be able to install these materials. You also want to think about the job site too. It's unlike staging a job with any other finish. You really need a lot of room to stage an area. You need a big workbench. You need room to maneuver these panels around. You also want to take a look at the layout of the project. Can you even move these panels? Say you have to move them to upper floors. Are the elevators able to handle them? Can you fit these materials in the elevator? If not, you might need smaller modules, if you will. So just some things to consider because they're very different than your traditional tiles. Here's another photo of the installation frame being used vertically. You can see all those suction cups riding along the top edge of that frame. And then, you have to have some manpower to be able to lift these materials, right? So, you have 2 or 3 people there hoisting that tile that's fully loaded with adhesive mortar on the back. So that's kind of the process that we're going to go through. So there's tools that are required that are a little different than the traditional tools of a regular ceramic or porcelain tile installation. You'll see that the notch trowel looks different. Even the cutter in the lower left-hand corner there is different. So that's a slide cutter, and you see that there are, again, suction cups that attach to the tile panel itself. And then there's a glass cutter, if you will, or a tool that looks like a glass cutter that rides along that rail that basically scores the finish, and then it can be snapped. You have the installation frame, again, on the right-hand side that helps move those materials. And even in the lower right-hand picture, just to these caps that are put on the tiles themselves to protect the corners, just when you're moving them around so they don't chip. Because just the investment in one of these panels is pretty great. So we want to make sure that those tiles are treated well, they're not dinged, and you won't have to incur costs just to replace them just from moving them around. Here's some more tools. You'll see snippers that are on the lower side there that can be used to grab a tile that's scored and to snap them. You'll see the rails there again. That's where the cutter runs along, and it scores it in place as well. So special handling, special cutters, special frames are all required here. Here's another photo of that rail cutter on the left-hand side that's placed on type of a panel. So you also see a large table, a large working area that's required as well. That's much different than regular tile setting, which usually all takes place on the floor. But here you want to have a nice bench. You want to have a nice area to stage your work. It's got to be nice and clean so these panels lay nice and flat to be able to be constructive with the work. Even the trowels themselves are different. And the reason for this is because you're putting so much adhesive on these large thin panels, you want to make sure that the adhesive is already going to collapse or starting to collapse onto itself to make sure that you get full coverage. So the trowel on the upper left there is called a slant notch trowel. And you'll see as you apply the adhesive mortar, the ridges are already on their way to collapsing, which makes it easier to release entrapped air that might be within the system. The trowel to the lower right there is called a Euro notch trowel, and you'll see that the teeth configuration is different as well, but they're all built to make sure that the adhesive can collapse onto itself. So the adhesive mortar requirements for these materials is to use the more high performance product, the materials that have higher bond strength. So in our line, we have found that the Laticrete 254 Platinum is one of the best products to use for this material. It has high bond strength, it has high shears and high tensile strengths as well, a long open time that allows you to be able to spread the adhesive on both the substrate and the tile back while staying wet and tacky and getting great transfer and coverage. You'll also see that there's ISO standards. There's the C2 level. Those are the preferred levels versus the C1 level. And in ANSI, the 118.15 level is the preferred adhesive type versus the ANSI 118.4 level, which is your traditional thin set mortar. So again, in our line, the 254 Platinum is the best product for this. It is a thin bed mortar. If you needed to use an LHT mortar or a large and heavy tile mortar, we have those products as well. And that can be our Trilite, our LHT mortar, or our 4XLT product. So we have products that fit into all of those categories. So just a little bit about ANSI. If you really think about it, ANSI is really evolved over the years too, and that they've added additional characteristics to their adhesive mortar designations, if you will. So some of these characteristics are indicated by the letter T, which is thixotropic or non-sag, or E, extended working time, which is ideal for these types of finishes, or F, which is fast setting, really not ideal for this, but it is an additional characteristic of ANSI. So you'll also see now that ANSI, you might see ANSI designations that appear something like 118.15 TE. So what that means is this is a high performance thin set mortar that has non-sag and extended working time characteristics. So that's really ideal for these types of finishes. And ANSI has put these characteristics in all of their thin set mortar classifications as well. So here's the large and heavy tile mortar, just so you see the difference between thin set and what we call LHT mortars. The photo on the top right there shows what happens when you use a thin set mortar and you build it up too thick. You see what happens, it starts to shrink and it starts to develop that big crack in the middle of it. That can cause hollow sounds, it can cause loss of bond. It can also cause the tile or the stone or whatever your finish to even warp and curl a little bit. So just something to keep in mind. Don't build up standard thin set mortars too thick. If you need to build them up, the LHT category, a large and heavy tile mortar, might be the better option. And again, in our line, we have several. Laticrete Trilite is depicted in this photo. And that characteristic, according to ANSI, is the H designation. So that fits, again, in all of those different categories, and you'll put an H next to it for the heavy tile mortar. ISO as well has their own standards. So in our industry, over the last maybe 5 to 8 years, we're starting to see ISO become more popular as far as specifications. So ISO is a little different than ANSI. That is really something that's heavy with tensile strengths, where ANSI relies heavily on shear bond strengths. ISO also has these various characteristics. You'll see standard performance, improved performance, and also the same characteristics as we saw before, with the T being non-sag, the E extended working time, and the F for fast setting. And there's so many more characteristics with ISO as well. If you want to have more information on that, the Tile Council of North America's handbook has a big section on ISO in the back of their handbook, which you can look at for references. Other adhesive types that may come into play, say you're going over something that's very hard to bond to, maybe a steel surface, or maybe a cooler, or something that requires an epoxy. Latipoxy 300 from Laticrete can also be used for those applications. We've seen like elevator floors where they might be steel type floors. The Latipoxy 300 is an ideal product for those applications as well. All right, so we've selected our adhesive mortar. We're ready to go now as far as installing these materials. So if you take a look again, the staging area there, you see the adhesive is mixed a little looser than traditional adhesive mortar. And the reason for that is, again, you wanna make sure that the ridges collapse onto themselves so that you don't get any entrapped air. So you pour out the adhesive mortar on the back of the panel, and you start using those required trowels, and you'll see that the ridges are always going in one area, or in one direction, sorry. You always want to go in the direction that's perpendicular to the longest edge, because that way you can get the air out in the shortest distance, if you will. So you see in the photo on the right, the trowel ridges are going in the short distance, and they're all going in the same direction. So typically you'll butter the back of the panel first, and then you'll spread the adhesive mortar onto the substrate. So you have your thin set mortar there in the picture on the left. It's a little looser than is typically mixed. You pour it out onto the substrate, and then again you see the trowel ridges all go in the same direction. So when the tile is placed, or these panels are placed, you have the adhesive mortar all going in the same area or in the same direction, and it's easier to collapse the adhesive mortar. So now we have the panel spread, the substrate is spread, and now we're ready to install the panel. So you'll see it sitting there on the frame, and you're just going to flip it over, and it's going to go right down into place. So you see there in the lower left-hand picture, now the panel is down in place. And now you have to embed the tile. So this is where it's a little different as well. In many instances, typically you would use a rubber mallet or a beading block or something else to embed the tile, or maybe you push it back and forth, you slide it back and forth to gain your type of coverage. With these materials, it can be challenging to do that. So here what we're seeing is a combination of different things that can help embed this tile or this panel type. You can use what we call the vibration method. This is really ideal for maybe walls. You see on the photo on the left-hand side, they're palm sanders with a rubber backing that doesn't damage the finish of the tile, and you just run it across the tile and you kind of embed it that way. It kind of shakes the tile into place to make sure that all the entrapped air is worked out of it. You can also use it on the floor, but it's a little bit more tedious on the floor. We found that this is more better suited for vertical work. Here's the big change. If we were to tell anybody that, yeah, you would walk on a floor tile, people would really look at you in a wrong way. But this is something that's even in the standards now. These panels aren't going to move. So we have found, and the industry has found, that shuffling or walking on these tiles is the best way to embed them. So you'll see the gentlemen here are systematically working their way across the tile, and that they're using it and embedding it in place this way. There's even a pattern, if you will, for the shuffling. So you see how you go back and forth, you go one way, and then you go the other way, and then you systematically try to embed the entire panel in this manner. One thing that it's important to note too is that labor for these, specifically these gauge thin tiles, has taken a position that only 5.5 millimeter and thicker materials can be used on floors. Now, some manufacturers will allow you to use the 3 millimeter type on floors, but you have to follow their installation practices specifically to make sure that it's going to work correctly. But in most cases, labor has taken a position that only 5.5 millimeter in thickness should be used on floors. Okay, so even when you're embedding these materials, we showed these photos a little earlier about edge leveling. So this is also different than your typical large format standard thickness materials. These edge leveling systems can really help to minimize that lippage and almost eliminate it. So you see different types that are used here. Some are straps where you attach it and then you kind of tighten it and it brings both surfaces to the same level. There's the wedge type. There's also others that basically are twist and level at the same time. So there's many types of edge leveling systems, but they're also, regardless of which one you use, they're ideal for this. Here's a standard thickness, large format porcelain tile. This tile is about maybe 3/8 to 1/2 inch in thickness. So they can also be used for standard thickness tiles as well. A little bit more tedious, but it really makes a big difference in minimizing lippage. So we strongly encourage their use, and they're also encouraged to be used in the standards that were created. Here again, you see the strapping systems that are used both vertically and horizontally. And as you're doing this, we really also want to start thinking about cure rates now. How long should these floors or these walls cure before you start exposing them to traffic? One of the consensus or general consensus in this regard is to wait at least 72 hours if you're going to start putting traffic or cart traffic or heavy loads on these floors. That's a good rule of thumb. At 70 degrees, allow at least 3 days, and you can protect those floors from heavy traffic and lifts. And even at that point, you really should cover the floors with plywood to make sure that heavy lift or cart traffic won't damage these materials. You know, your adhesive mortar is probably going to take a little bit longer to cure because they're under these large format panels and tiles. So it's good to think about how much time you need to allow this to cure sufficiently. So 3 days is a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. Here's also an illustration of what your adhesive mortar, what happens with coverage as your tiles get larger. So the illustration on the lower left-hand corner there, you see a 4x4 or 6x6 tile. And those are really easy to get good coverage. You see the entire back is covered. But as the tile size increases, you'll see that the coverage becomes even more of a challenge, just in standard format thickness products. So you can imagine what it's going to be like in one of these large thin tiles. So you want to make sure that we follow the good practices of selecting the right trowel, using the right technique, and making sure that we get the proper coverage. So for these large thin tiles, it's a different type of calculation that the standard outlines of what type of coverage you want to get. And I'll try to cover it briefly. Basically, is around the edge, the first 2 inches around the edges of these panels, you want to make sure there's absolutely no voids whatsoever. And then interior from there, in any single square foot, the minimum coverage is 85% in any given square foot on the inside of the 2-inch edge, if that makes sense. So that's different than your regular coverage criteria of a large format material, which could either be 80% for interior work or 95% for exterior work. But just keep in mind that you want to get maximum coverage. You want to embed these tiles so there's no voids. So if you roll a card over them or you drop something on them, you're not going to hit a pocket or a void that doesn't have adhesive coverage. Okay, so now we're ready to grout. So we have our tiles in place. We have, whether they're large format, regular thickness tiles or the large gauged tiles, they're in place, they've cured. We also want to make sure that we clean out all the grout or the grout lines of any adhesive mortar. Keep in mind, these are really tight joints. Usually they're 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch. And some of these panels are very thin as well, as thin as 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch. So there's not a lot of room for grout. So we want to make sure we clear those joints out completely of all adhesive mortar so that we can get the grout into that joint and cavity. So which grout should we use? Can we use either, if you will, cement-based or epoxy-based? And the answer really is yes, you can use either one. For best performance, especially on floors, the epoxy grout usually works best. It's going to be your more durable one, your more stain-resistant one, and more color-fast. And again, ideal for these thin joints that doesn't have a lot of body to them. If you want to use a cement-based grout, then we have our Permacolor line. We have our premium cement grout, which meets ANSI 118.7. It's called Permacolor Select, which has a single base color. And then we have color packs. If you see the illustration on the right-hand side there, we have a separate color pack that you can add to the base color to create our 40 standard colors. Or if you want to special match any color, we can do that for you too. So if there's a specific, say a specific blue that you want to match, all you have to do is give us a swatch of it and we can custom color match it to hit any color out there. So again, either one of these is fine for these materials. Permacolor Select as the cement grout and SpectraLock Pro Premium grout as our epoxy grout. Now on the edges, and we also have to keep in mind that these materials, especially the thin gauged porcelains, don't have what we call bullnose or trim pieces. So you might have to use an aluminum or plastic edge to finish any exposed edges. Some installers who are really expert with these products can even finish and round out the colors by profiling them themselves with their own grinders and tools. So some installers have become very, very proficient with that. You can also use a flexible sealant, as we see depicted there on the right, like our Laticrete, which is a silicone that can be used for all movement joints and all transition joints as well. Excuse me. Some of these finishes can also be used for exterior veneers. But just keep in mind that if you're going to use them there, consult with your local building code as to tile panel size, facial dimensions, and also thickness. Those can both come into play on exterior veneers. So they can be used, they have been used. This is a great example of them, and they provide nice, clean lines. They almost look like metal panels. They're really, really sharp looking when you use them exterior, but just consult with your local building codes to make sure that they're conforming, and if you need any waivers, that the building department works with you on that manner. Movement joints are absolutely essential in any tile installation. So here we see depicted a floor installation and a vertical one. You can use pre-formed strips or the silicone, fully sealant filled joints as we saw before using Laticrete Laticel silicone. But they are absolutely necessary in any installation. And the Tile Council of North America provides a lot of information with their section on this, and it's EJ 171 in their handbook that talks about that. And then again, protection. We talked a little bit about it a few minutes ago, but this illustrates what happens when these floors aren't protected. You know, you can drop things on them. You don't have good coverage. Edges chip. This is one of the most really disturbing things I ever see when I see installations, is to see edges cracked like this. It really is unsightly and takes away from our industry as a whole as to the durability of tile finishes. We want to make sure that we give our industry a good, we shine a nice light on it. So carrying the installations correctly, protecting them with plywood, if other trades are going to work on them, is really essential to ensure that the floor has a fighting chance and that we don't wind up with these unsightly cracks and chips and dings on these floors. So this just kind of illustrates what can happen when we don't protect and cure these installations correctly. So in summary, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the installation holistically. We just don't want to think about the finishes. We want to think about everything from surface preparation, how that's properly done, to controlling lippage to make sure that the finishes are going to be nice and smooth and flat. We want to use the right installation materials, as we talked about earlier, and using a whole system of products from a single source manufacturer is always ideal. So again, Laticrete provides these materials from leveling mortars to membranes, crack isolation, waterproofing, sound control, floor warming, all the way to the right adhesive mortars to use, as well as the grouting products. And when we do that, we can ensure that we have a very successful installation. So just keep that in mind. Again, look at the installation holistically, and your adhesive manufacturer or installation materials manufacturer can ensure that you have a nice, successful installation, and also one that's backed by a full system warranty. So using that single source type of supply can result in that end result. So that's all I have for now. Again, I appreciate everybody taking their time out of their busy day to attend our presentation. And now I'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Thank you, Arthur. We appreciate all the information. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the question pane at this time, and we'll get some answers for you. If we do run out of time this morning to answer all of your questions, please know that your questions will be forwarded to Arthur and the folks over at Laticrete to get answers for you. So go ahead and take a minute to put your questions in there and submit them. But Arthur, before we go to questions from your attendees, do you have some common questions that you get asked about your products?
Yeah, we do, and a lot of it has to do with what is the right product to use. You know, as you can imagine, we make so many products. So the question is, which adhesive mortar should I use for a given application? It really depends on what you're looking to do. So in this topic here, we would basically suggest two products that you can use consistently. So the 254 Platinum as a thin bed mortar is usually the best product to use for these materials. And if you're looking to use what we call an LHT mortar or a thin set mortar that can be built up a little bit thicker, our Laticrete Tri-Lite is ideal. So if you have one of each, if you will, a regular thin bed mortar and an LHT mortar, you can basically do any of these installations that we talked about today.
Great, thank you. And Arthur, we got a question in just a moment ago, and this person is wanting to know, on the large format tile, approximately how much is the labor per square foot? How long for each piece? This person says, I work at the union hourly shop and we price it by the hour-ish, just trying to get an idea on labor versus what we usually install, which is products that are 12 inches or smaller. Generally speaking, she said, because markets are different.
Yeah, it's a great question. We do get that, and it really is a tough question to answer. From what we've seen, it does take a little bit longer to install those large gauged panels. Usually, if it's a panel that's larger than, say, 3 foot by 3 foot, right, or a meter square. If it's a meter square or less, you could probably use your standard labor rates. But if it gets to be larger, any edge larger than 3 foot, it's probably going to take 30% longer, maybe even 50% longer from our experience, what we've seen. And really, if you looked at the installation sequence, you know, you have to butter the back of that panel, you have to butter the floor, and it does take some effort to get that panel into position, to align it properly, and then to use the straps to level it. So I would say conservatively, you know, at least 30% more, maybe a little bit more in some other markets.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. And Amy, does that answer your question? If you want to expand on it, go ahead. If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and submit them. We are getting close to the end of our session. Nope, she says, yep, thanks. That answers her question. Thank you, Arthur. Arthur, do you have anything else you want to add? Any more information to give us about Laticrete today before we close out our session?
No, not really. I mean, we're here and available to assist anybody with any installation. So we can be easily reached, phone, web. Another interesting thing about Laticrete is we just launched we're the first in the industry to have launched a web chat feature on our website. So that's also cool. So if you want to just chat on our website, our technical service staff is ready to assist you in that manner too.
Very fun. Get some face-to-face answers. That's a great idea. All right, we are going to go ahead and close out our session then. Again, if you have additional questions, Arthur's information is here on your screen. You can contact him directly. We will also send you a copy of these slides so that you have his contact information. And we would like to thank Laticrete International for sponsoring today's webinar, and especially thank Arthur Minty for presenting it. Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
If you would like more information about the Laticrete product line, you can visit their website, laticrete.com. Again, Arthur's contact information is here in the presentation slides, which you'll get a copy of. And we're also going to send you a link to the recording. So we invite you to share that recording with anyone who's interested. And just a reminder that also that recording will be housed on the FCICA website and on our YouTube channel, where you'll be able to access it at any time. Now, if you are interested in participating in the FCICA promotional webinar series, you can contact me at kelly@fcica.com. And everyone, Arthur says, thank you very much for the session. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everyone.